Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced, and you're listening to Web Development 101. This is actually the first interview I'll be doing for the podcast with my buddy Dan Behrman. What some of you may not know is that I'm actually currently the vice chair of the Libertarian National Committee for the Libertarian Party, which is a role I probably have for another 2 months unless things get really bad. Then I may have to serve another 2 years. But basically, Dan is someone who I've met several times on my travels. Also, heavily involved in web development. So I thought I'd have him on the show so we can talk a little bit about sort of his career in web development and in development in general, and sort of what technology he enjoys, what he's done with it, and also any advice he can give to aspiring coders out there. So first, Dan, introduce yourself.
Yeah, hey, so I'm Dan Behrman. I in my political side, I go by Dan Taxation is Theft Behrman. I'm one of the presidential candidates for the Libertarian Party. Um, but yeah, I'm a software engineer. I've actually done a lot in video. I've kind of jumped back and forth in careers between video and software. Right now, I'm working for a company in New York doing software development. I do server-side development. Uh, Mostly, I guess now I'm doing mostly Golang. Um, but I've done a lot of PHP, a little bit of Python, and man, just so many languages in my history. JavaScript, lots of that. So yeah, I'm all over the place. I'm always learning new stuff and trying to, I guess, sharpen my toolkit. And yeah.
Cool. And basically, I heard you were working more recently with like Golang. Tell me a little bit about like how it feels to work with Golang when you're doing like server side back end stuff, and sort of the differences
Sure.
between that and like PHP.
So the main difference, of course, is that Golang is you build a service that's a long running process, whereas PHP is kind of designed well, there is a long running process in PHP now, but it was originally designed as a request comes in, it gets run into a script, the script starts up a new process, it does whatever it does, it outputs the output, and then it shuts down. And that's really, even though PHP is a long running process now, that still kind of happens internally. Um, Golang is, more of you create, when it comes to web services, you want to create a single long running instance that just communicates back and forth on a TCP port. Um, so I think that's the main difference. But there's and that kind of takes that kind of comes into play for, like, a few different things as far as uh, I guess the way you're going to structure your programs, handling memory and that sort of thing. And there are some considerations to take in with that. It's also it's a much more strict language, which if you're transitioning, that can be very difficult. But yeah, overall, I'm really liking it. I do have a background where I guess probably when I was in my teens, I was actually learning C++ for a while. I wrote this Tetris game. I stole the idea from, like, we had an Apple IIgs in my middle school class that had this. It was called Dual Tris. So it was like two players play Tetris, and if you can get all four lines, it sends it over to the other guy's side. Um, and so it was like a competitive game, and so I wrote that in C++ for Mac. So I had a little bit of experience with that. And Go it's different from C++, but I would say it's closer to that from PHP. And Yeah, so it's been really interesting, and just, I would say, like, I've only been using it for maybe 6 months, and even the iterations of how the language works, and maybe not so much the language itself, but like the dependency managers, um, uh, like the Go mod files and everything has changed a lot just in that time. So it's really kind of interesting to see this stuff evolve. But yeah, it's been really fun.
Yeah, and are you working with any frameworks like Mux or Buffalo for that particular backend, or are you?
So we use Gin for the main HTTP server. So of course, you don't have to write the actual, like, open the port, open port 80 and listen for a connection. Um, and that handles, like, routing to different controllers and everything. We're starting to do, because we're using a lot of microservices, we're starting to use GRPC, which basically is, um, I guess it's an HTTP2 based protocol that runs between services. So you set up different services. One might handle one thing, another one might handle another thing. A user makes a request to one over HTTP, and or HTTPS, usually through a proxy or something. But it's a regular HTTP request, and then it uses, like, this from one service, if it wants to get information from the other service, it has this kind of open connection that it maintains, so that it can it reduces some overhead, and it can just say, hey, I need some more information, and it uses uh, basically a struct format that's
Mm,
common to both applications, so that as you're sending information, you create a struct, and you can actually have that struct in a shared library, so that you can ensure, this is what's going to be here, and what you're gonna send and what you're gonna receive, which is really interesting because working with a lot of APIs, there's sometimes there's uncertainty. Like we work with, like, I mean, there's like some big corporations that we have as third party services, and they give us API documentation, and then all of a sudden we find out there's actually like these hidden parameters that
mhm.
are just completely undocumented, and sometimes you don't know exactly where they go, or what field type. Is it the number one, or is it the digit one? That sort of thing. So this grpc system actually makes it a little bit easier to figure some of that stuff out, which is pretty cool.
Got it. Okay, so because GRPC is definitely like a new thing. I've seen a couple videos on it trying to understand. So I think your explanation kind of made it a little bit clearer. So basically, let me recap that. So the idea is I could create like multiple backend applications, like multiple microservices, but kind of open sort of like a WebSocket between them, so that way they can kind of
Right.
continue communicating. And basically, with Go, since you have structs, that's kind of making it easier to identify sort of what are these extra parameters, or making sure everything's consistent and acting as a
Yes,
schema
you
of
would
sorts.
import those structs into the server and the client, so everybody has access to the same structs,
Mm-hmm.
and you'd have your input struct and your output struct. And so because everyone's using the same struct, you can make sure you're sent your exactly what all the possible fields are, and have everything filled out. And yeah, and it handles, you basically establish a connection, and it handles all of the back and forth and transferring and everything else.
Okay.
So yeah, it really kind of simplifies making a connection to another server.
Okay, that sounds pretty cool. That kind of the struct part at least reminds me of what I like a lot about GraphQL, because by in GraphQL, like I can define all my types, and then basically I know exactly what I need to put in to make my like query mutation. Like I've definitely fallen in love with GraphQL APIs. On that, so you've done far as backend, you've done JavaScript. Is JavaScript you do mostly on the front end JavaScript, or have you done a little bit of both? Sort of like I guess like JavaScript is always such an entry point for most developers. Sort of
Right.
what is your relationship with JavaScript?
So it's a love hate relationship. Yeah, because I mean, like the first time I used it was probably back when like a lot of people still used Internet Explorer, um, and so I'd write some like basic application, and it would work perfect in like every browser, and then someone would say, hey, the website's not working, and it would be Explorer, of course, and then I'd go try to figure it out, and they would just give like these absolutely like vague errors where it was like, what does this even mean? Unknown error, something like that. So going all the way back there, I mean, I've done everything with it. I've used it with Node to build a lot of backend packages, so like minifying JS files before they go to production, and that sort of thing. And I want to say I've worked with some. I want to say I've worked with like maybe some services that were actually running on Node, actually serving up web contents or API requests. Um, but yeah, it's really kind of all over the place, and I kind of like it sometimes, but then sometimes I'm just like, this is way too complicated, and it really shouldn't have to be this way. So that's why I say it's kind of a love hate love hate thing.
What's your favorite like stack? Like basically, if you were to sit there and design your next project and decide what all the different pieces you're going to use are for your back end, for your front end, all the pieces, what would be the pieces you would choose?
Man, so if you would have asked me that like 6 months ago, I would have definitely said PHP. Now I think if I had to do that again, and I've actually written an entire framework on PHP, as kind of a pet project. I kind of want to say I would do that in Go now. Um, but as far as of course, as far as a front end to tie into it, the framework that I built was so I just built the back end. The front end I use existing framework, so I used Foundation. Since then, I've used Angular, which I think a combination of Angular and Foundation is would be really powerful. because of course, Foundation really just handles like the design and the
Mm-hmm.
layout and that sort of thing. But Angular is really great for actually populating the information and making it, making it like an actual web application and not like a page to page kind of thing. So I think that's really cool. I think those are probably some of the favorite tools. Um, I'm I'm starting to get into Docker now, so there's probably be a little bit of that. And as far as databases, I've really always liked Percona,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is it's basically a plugin replacement for MySQL and InnoDB. I really, I mean, one, MySQL is just so classic. It's just it's so easy to use and it's everywhere. Percona, I actually read this really amazing book because I'm totally like a performance nerd. Like if I can cut milliseconds out of something, I'll totally go for it. And there was this really amazing book. Uh, it was called like High Performance MySQL, and that turned me on to Percona, which basically what Percona does is they take MySQL and they take Mongo, and they basically add some extra tools to it to make it perform even better. So those are the kind of tools I would use. Mongo, if I needed to use any NoSQL type thing, Mongo is kind of the one I prefer. Um, and yeah, so there's a lot of tools in there. But it really just kind of depends on the project.
Got it. And then how, on that note, like, what would be sort of what would make you decide between going no SQL versus SQL in your database?
I think that really depends on the data type. And actually, what's really interesting is MySQL now actually has a NoSQL or like a JSON
Mm-hmm.
column,
Hmm.
which kind of, I don't know how it compares directly to Mongo. I haven't done like any tests or anything yet, but it seems to be a similar kind of thing. I think Mongo has more tools as far as aggregation and processing the data. But as I've seen in some projects, that actually turns out to be a complete nightmare because what we have this there's this one project that I worked on, where essentially by saying, Mongo can take this data from a database and then it can transform it and transform it and transform it, through like their aggregation and everything. What ended up happening was we created a system. Well, somebody created a system that, the queries were like literally 50 kilobytes long, which made them like impossible to debug. But then worse than that was, it wasn't just a query that was written out. It was, you had different sub functions that were creating different components of the query and then assembling them all together, which made it even more like, once you debug the query itself, now you have to figure out where it's being assembled and how that's working. So that can definitely be abused. And I kind of like to have all my processing in one language, right? So if you're going to process the data that's coming out, you might as well do it in the data of in the language of your actual application. Um, and I guess the one reason I wanted to emphasize that somebody else did it, not is so I
Mm-hmm.
don't have to take blame for it, but because, as a new project coming into this, not understanding what all these components are and being so complex, made it extremely difficult. On top of, just like, now that I know where everything is, it's difficult. But not having known in the first place, it just made it that much more difficult. But going back to the question of which one, um, it really depends on the data type. I mean, if you tried to do something in MySQL with, like, maybe you have a very flexible data type where sometimes you have some fields and not other fields, you end up with a bunch of columns that have null values in them or something. And that's of course not very efficient. But if you can use a text column with JSON in it, and if you can index that information, and that comes back to how frequently are you going to use all that information, how big is that information, and there's a lot of different things to take into it. But I think for the most part, most systems would still, I'd still use MySQL, for for most situations. I think Mongo would have to be something a little bit more specific, that warrants switching out of that.
Now, if you were to give advice to someone who is just sort of entering the development field, they just graduated about boot camp, so they know a little bit of React, they know a little Angular, they know some Mongo, some Postgres. Where would you tell them, like, how would to break in, where the opportunities are, where are the trends that you've seen?
So I would say there's two ways. One is find a hobby project and just start working on it because, and I know everybody learns differently, but for me, having the desire to want to do something because it was a pet project really made me dig in, and like whatever I didn't know, it forced me to go out and Google it and figure it out and make it happen. Um, I've also done a lot of you know just you have to be confident in your skills and your ability to learn. And I don't want to say misrepresent yourself when you go out to a job interview, but I've been through a lot of fake it till you make it kind of things where I understand enough of the technology even though I haven't actually put it into use yet, to be able to go into a job interview and say, yes, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. And then when you get hired, you have a little bit of time to figure it out. You have because of course any job you take, and I hear this from everybody. They get hired for a new job and they're like, I don't know what I'm doing. I think I'm going to get fired because I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not being very productive at all. But there's that's for everybody. I mean, you could be the best developer in the world, and you're working on new code that you don't understand. You're working on new infrastructure. So there's a learning curve no matter who you are and what you're working on. And so there's that, but then at the same time that gives you an opportunity to learn new things. And like I said, like apply for a job that's a little bit harder than what you think you're capable of, and that's going to force you to get out there and learn. And once you learn that, I mean, that's kind of been my whole career, is I get a job that asks a little bit more, that like I go in there and I'm a little bit scared, like I don't know if I can handle all this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And then once I'm there for like a year or two, it becomes so comfortable. It's like, man, all this stuff was easy. What was I ever worried about? But it's because I learned so many new skills. And then, from there, it's easy to go to the next job and say, okay, let me find something that's a little bit harder and find something that you're uncomfortable getting into, because really, I mean, that's how you get better, and that's how you get paid more too. So that's probably the best advice I can give.
Yes, awesome. And then if anybody who's listening would like to like get in touch with you for to ask you further questions or ask for advice, where's a good place to reach you or find you on the internet?
Sure. So, man, pretty much everything I do online is political now. So I guess I would just say look up Dan Behrman, the taxation is theft. Well, Dan taxation is theft on maybe on Facebook or Twitter, and you can find me there and send me a message. And yeah, that's
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 fine.
probably the best way to go.
Awesome. Okay, well, Dan, thanks for coming on the show, and always a delight to talk. And thank you. This was a very fun conversation, very illuminating. I definitely learned a few new things, so this was very good.
Awesome.